I noticed one kind of really random coincidence whilst preparing the episode, which is you're from Australia and you live in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had 30 episodes or 30 guests on my podcast so far, and you're not the first person with a Norway-Australia connection.
Really? Who's the other person?
Hannah Watkins. She did kind of standard academic work, did a PhD, did a postdoc, but now she works in Australia for the Behavioral Insights Unit, which I guess is like a nudge unit or kind of, trying to get doctors to prescribe fewer antibiotics and that kind of stuff. And I think her middle name is Melgaard. So it's Hannah Melgaard Watkins. And I think she's actually half Norwegian, half Australian or something. I don't know. I didn't ask her. But yeah, there can't be that many people. Like if you look at the amount of Australians and Norwegians there can't be that many. Like the intersection of those two circles has to...
There's quite a few because I think a lot of the universities have these exchange agreements. And I actually, before I even knew anything about Norway, I was very close to actually doing an exchange year in my undergraduate in Norway. I didn't end up doing it.
Okay.
And there's a lot of Norwegians come to study in Australia. That's how I met my wife. She came to Australia to study, married her, moved back to Norway. And there's a lot of back and forth within sort of medicine, within sort of ecology, in those sorts of areas. So yeah, there's quite a few Australian academics in Norway and vice versa. Surprisingly.
Yeah, I thought, because you basically can't be further away, two countries on the globe,
it's
basically.
Basically the antipodes, yeah, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. And do you know why? Is it just, Australia is always an interesting destination for exchange students from Europe.
It's always seen as very exotic in Norway. They love home and away here for some reason. And I think it's the same sort of thing. We see Norway, it's like as very exotic as well. So it's a nice little exchange.
I guess also for Norwegians, there's a thing that you can escape Norwegian winters. Actually get some sunlight for half of a year.
Well, that's what they tell me. They're like, "Why did you move here? You're missing the summers." But there's much more to life than the weather, and I think the weather's fine. But the only hard bit is the sunlight, where in winter, sun goes down around 3:00, gets up around 9. But other than that, I think it's great.
Yeah, no, I've never been to Norway, but I spent half a year in Stockholm.
Okay.
The summer was beautiful, but
it's amazing.
I do wonder. They did mention when you have those 4 hours of daylight in winter
stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, actually, one of the reasons I also bring this up is because I tried to listen to and look up as much about you as I could kind of before this interview. I don't know where this was exactly, but on some place you mentioned specifically that for your postdoc you planned to move not only to Norway but to Oslo. I think it was pretty specifically the way you described it there. That was kind of, often for example, I'm bringing this also up because I've got a year and a bit left on my PhD, so kind of postdoc application is something I'm thinking about in general. And for me, it's very much where do I want to go? I don't know, anywhere basically. But I'm just curious, how much harder did it make it knowing there's one town that's not tiny but not huge either, where you want to go and apply for stuff?
I guess it was a lot harder and there was a lot of luck involved. The time that I was looking for a postdoc, almost out of nowhere, a position came up which was perfect for me. And I got extremely lucky. There's no other way to put it. I was either going to be happy staying in Australia and continue to do a postdoc in Australia, but the idea was if something pops up in Oslo, then I'll be keen to move there. Okay. And something did. And it was just, obviously I'd worked hard to get to the point where I was, at least competitive for the position. But at the same time, the fact that this particular position came up doing something which not that many people in the world would have the expertise to do was just, it was absolutely wild. I still look back at my career and see so many of these almost sliding door moments going, I got really lucky there. I remember getting into my PhD, at least within Australia, you generally need to be funded to do a PhD. If you get a very high mark within your undergraduate degree, then you'll get government funding to get support to do your PhD. Otherwise, you won't get accepted. I applied for this scholarship that would actually give me funding, and essentially, I got a letter saying you didn't win. But then a week later, But then a week later, I was told you were actually ranked second, and the person that won had pulled out. So congratulations. Like, if that person didn't pull out, I wouldn't have done a PhD. There are so many of those situations where I think, gee, I just got so lucky, and I always wonder for how long is my luck going to ride out? I'll keep riding that wave. But getting that postdoc offer was just an incredible amount of luck.
Yeah, I find this luck that, I mean, as you said, like it's not like you were sitting around doing your PhD and just waiting. I was like, oh, well, there's a chance. Luckily, I can take it. You know, it does take a lot of effort to be able to be lucky.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess for me, it's kind of similar. You know, first year of the bachelor's, I really wanted to do research and science. And then in my second year, I had, I guess, a second year div and decided, basically, if tuition fees in the UK hadn't been that high or I'd been from a rich family, I might have quit, but basically I couldn't afford to spend a few €1,000 and then just say after 2 years, like, whatever, I'll stop. But then we had like a tutor for like 10 people each or something like that, like just to kind of help people out for anything. He mentioned, there's these like summer internship kind of scholarships you can do to do some research, you earn a bit of money, and if anyone's interested, let me know. And I think I was the only one who said, I'll do it. And the main reason I did it was because I wanted to earn money so I could buy a camera. And and then I did it. And I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to do research.
Yeah.
And the only reason is, luckily, they didn't ask for grades in second year because mine were terrible. My good grades in first year, but terrible in second year. So luckily, they only asked for that. And then, I mean, I guess I'm only still my PhD, but that could have ended it very, very quickly if that hadn't happened. Oh, and also like there were like 3 scholarship things we could apply for, we thought, but one was, what's the nice word? Discontinued that year. And there was one where the deadline was tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
And so I literally had to drive across London to like hand them the application and paper. But yeah. Okay. So like it wasn't, okay. So like I guess you moved to Oslo was somewhat specific and relied on some luck, but it wasn't as, from the way I remembered, it was really like, I'm going to move to Oslo and do. And then
look, that was what I really, really wanted to happen. I could have probably found something within Australia or within Sydney. There's a couple of institutions within Sydney that would have been fine. But the intention was I really, really wanted to go overseas. And, obviously Norway made a lot of sense because my wife's family lives around Oslo. And I thought, I want to make this happen. And I was really boxing myself in because there really is only one institution within Oslo that does my sort of stuff. I mean, there is a few other institutions that do other stuff that I maybe could have been applicable for, or maybe could have been well suited for. Look, I just rolled the dice, and the opportunity came, which is incredible, and I still pinch myself, honestly.
Yeah. So it seems like Norway was also then. I mean, there was the connection through your wife, but it wasn't. That seems also like coincidence about Norway, because I guess you just said you wanted to go overseas. I mean, you would have made your life easy if you said, I'll go to London, for example, right?
As an Aussie, of course, yeah. But I mean, look, I've always been fascinated by Norway.
Well, I mean, also in terms of just the amount of labs that are there.
Oh,
like just the opportunities.
Much more opportunity.
You wouldn't really have to have been lucky even.
Yeah, I mean, there would have been heaps of opportunities. But look, I've always been fascinated by Norway. Before I moved there, I'd visited a number of times with my wife. So I thought this is a really nice country, and do not regret a moment of doing it. I mean, of course, it's hard being away from family who are back, family and friends back in Australia, but everything else, it's fantastic here.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I think I've only heard good stuff about Norway from people who moved there. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll see a position to apply for it.
The beer's too expensive. That's my only. That's my only complaint. I have to, when someone goes, "Oh, do you like me out for some beers?" I have to check their bank account.
Sorry, I'm only a research like a senior scientist. I'm not a professor yet.
I'm not a professor. I can't take the hit. Or you have to. They have this thing. It's called the literal translation is like salary beers. So like the Friday after salary usually gets paid, everyone goes out for drinks because that's the one time of the month that everyone can afford it. It's I mean, I'm sure if you work hard and save your money, you can afford a beer even on a different day. Oh no,
if you really put your mind to it.
If you really want it.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think this episode is going to be one of very rough transitions from one topic to the next, because synthetic data sets and podcasts, there's basically no link. So I'd like to talk about the basically synthetic data sets and your prime in particular, because I think it's really interesting, and I don't think I've heard about this concept outside of I've probably heard about this on your podcast. I'm assuming you've mentioned it on Everything Hertz at some point.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would have heard about this other than that. And maybe if I randomly come across your primer, could you maybe for a minute or two kind of roughly describe what synthetic data sets are, why they're interesting, and just as a kind of get the ball rolling.
When it comes to synthetic data sets, this was a case of me trying to scratch my own itch in terms of the problem of I want to share my data, but a lot of my data is very sensitive. You don't want to disclose a lot of this information for some of the populations that I'm working with. I do a lot of work with autism, for instance, but there isn't that many people with autism within the Oslo area because there's only about 1 million people in Oslo. So it's very difficult to keep or maintain, participants want to keep their privacy in a lot of circumstances. So I think when a lot of people are talking about sharing data, they speak of it as if it's a very easy task. They're like, why don't you just share your data? Because, and when you drill down to it, a lot of these people are working with like reaction time data, for instance, or visual perception, in which sharing visual perception reaction time data, there really isn't any risks when it comes to disclosing that sort of data with your participants. And obviously, within the biobehavioral sciences, we're experiencing a reproducibility crisis. And one of those ways that we can improve or increase the robustness of our results is by sharing our data sets. By sharing your data sets, other people can verify your work. That's including peer reviewers, but also other people. But these open data sets can also be used to generate new hypotheses. As we know, collecting data can be expensive, very time consuming. But if someone has already collected a data set which is addressing the sort of research questions that you're interested in, and the data set and it's open, you can actually go in there and you can do some hypothesis generation, and you can analyze the data, and you can say this really cool thing popped up, and then you can use that as a basis for future hypothesis-driven research. So there's a lot of benefits to open data, verification, but also generating new hypotheses. But we have these challenges within a lot of populations, particularly if you're working with clinical populations or vulnerable populations, and you have this tension between the utility of open data and also the need for disclosure protection. Open data has no disclosure protection, but no utility. But plenty of utility, but closed data has a lot of disclosure protection, but almost no utility. So synthetic data sets bridge those two different things, because essentially with this synthetic data set, what you've got is a data set which mimics the statistical properties of your original data set, yet no participant in your synthetic data set represents a real individual. So you can go through, say you have 100 individuals, and each of them you have 10 variables. It could be age, it could be some score on some sort of personality test or something, a whole bunch of demographics. If you go through every single one of those participants with a synthetic data set, not one of those rows will represent a real person. And so what you can do is with that is, if you're publishing a paper, then you can say outright, we couldn't share our data, our raw data, because of privacy, which I think is reasonable in many circumstances. But we've shared a synthetic data set which mimics the same statistical properties. You can run the analysis, and you will get more or less the same. You'll get the same conclusions and more or less the same numbers. And as a benefit, you can actually do some exploratory analysis on this data as well. And this is a very handy way, and I think it solves this problem of how can we share our data while protecting participant privacy. And this is something I was thinking about for my own research because of the vulnerable populations that I work with. And I just started doing some digging around, and I discovered this because this is actually commonly done with census data. We're talking about like hundreds of thousands of people, and the government obviously wants to share this data so other researchers can ask interesting questions in terms of demographics. But of course, you need to respect the privacy of participants or people who have taken the census. So this idea of synthetic data came about in order to solve that problem, but only more recently has it been applied to the biobehavioral sciences or to medicine. And I'd only seen like 2 studies which have actually used this, and I thought, I need to promote this. This is super interesting. And when it comes to, every year I give myself a project. I give myself a meta-science project. It's my summer meta-science project. I'm a nerd. That's what I do for fun. And that particular year, I'm like, I am going to learn this thing back to front. to the point where I can write a tutorial paper on it so that I can use this for my future work, but also so I can promote this to other people. And I always think when it comes to writing papers is that if you're helping other people scratch their itch, making them feel like the hero that like, this is super easy, I can do this myself, those are the papers which get a lot of attention and that are the most useful. And it's amazing, like with so much of this sort of meta science stuff, this is the stuff that, granting agencies and when it comes to promotions, it doesn't matter as much. They don't really care about this sort of meta science stuff. But when it comes to the stuff that's having the real impact, getting the most attention, the most clicks, this is the stuff that actually gets the most attention there. So I wrote this paper for how to actually create your own synthetic data sets. And I think another benefit of doing this as well is that sometimes when you're reading a paper, it can be very difficult to follow the analysis of what people have done, unless they're doing something very basic. We ran some t-tests. I'm like, okay, that's fine. But some people have some very complicated analysis. And as much as they try and describe it, it's still very difficult to follow what they're doing. Some people may actually add an R script, which can help to see what they're doing, but still the R script can be difficult to read. But if you're sharing a synthetic data set, you can literally run the whole analysis with this script that they're sharing, and so you can better understand what they're doing. So when it comes to this analysis, there are two things that you need to consider. It's not a matter of just pressing a button and it's automatically going to generate the synthetic data set. In some cases, it is actually that easy, but you need to verify that it does represent the original data. And so there are two things you need to consider: whether it has general utility, that is, does the data behave the same way in terms of what are the means and standard deviations of the variables? What are the relationships between variables? You want to make sure that those things are behaving roughly similar.
So that's like a thing you have to test manually.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is part of the SynthPop package, which is what the tutorial is about. So when you're running it, you want to test, does it have good general utility? Do these data sets roughly behave the same? The next thing is testing specific utility, in that, do the analyses that I run in the original data set mimic the synthetic data set? And you can actually report, there are statistics that you can report. So you can actually see, yep, these things are essentially the same or very similar. And once you have those two things, then you can be very, very confident that one, the synthetic data set can reproduce the same results as the original data set. And if you have strong general utility, that's also a really good thing for data exploration, because you can be fairly confident that if someone else is having a play around with your data, they're going to get roughly the same conclusions as if they were playing with the real data. But the benefit here is if someone does that, then they can say, hey, I played with your synthetic data set, I got this result. Can you run this script on the real data just to verify that it's the same thing? And it makes it a lot easier to actually do that sort of exploratory stuff. So yeah, there's a ton of benefits here. And it's really encouraging to see a lot of people beginning to do this within their papers. I set up my Google Scholar alerts for when people are citing my stuff. And one of the most exciting alerts is to get someone who's used this in their own research, because I'm like, great, that's one more paper where someone's data can be verified and someone can actually share their data so other people can run exploratory analysis on the data.
I guess it's interesting, right? Like every time you get an alert for that one, that means there's an open data set that probably wouldn't have been open before.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I basically like to talk more about all the different strands you kind of mentioned in that introduction. Yeah, I find it like maybe to with something you mentioned at the beginning, like I agree, like sharing data always sounds very easy. And then even if you have a basic data set, I mean, in a sense it should be relatively easy, but I've noticed since I've started, I started with the intention of sharing data and code from the beginning of my PhD, but only once we came to the stage where we wanted to publish stuff did I realize that my code and data probably wasn't in a necessarily publishable format, and then I had to, write it better so it can be improved and so it can be published. And I think it's an important point to say, like, sharing data isn't the easiest thing, even if you have data that is in principle shareable, like, that doesn't have these clinical things. But yeah, I think one thing that I thought we could do is kind of use one study that I'm thinking about applying this to, and then kind of using that to kind of see what some problems might be with it, or where it works or doesn't work, and that kind of stuff. So the study for which I basically read your article, I do fairly like basic decision-making, economic games, and social interactions kind of stuff. Not really the data where there's really any problems about privacy or anything like that. It's anonymous data, of course, but there's no real problem there per se. But then we randomly kind of had the chance to collect data with prison inmates who were in so this was in or around Hamburg, where I started my PhD. Our lab kind of moved halfway through. And so we got the chance to collect data in I don't know whether it's maximum or high security, whatever exactly the levels are, but some of the people who are there and who I've met are some very bad boys, and they've done some very bad things. I think including murder and child rape and all sorts of things. And the interesting measure here for us is this psychopathy measure, the PCLR score, which I think every inmate gets there. The problem is if you have a super high psychopathy score, it means basically the definition is you're a psychopath beyond a certain point. And basically if you know this person is this age and has probably done something heinous in or around Hamburg, you can probably more or less Google the news and figure out who it is, even in a city as big as Hamburg. So that's the kind of general thing where the data I have is pretty straightforward. It's just some binary decisions, corporate defect, some scales from 0 to 100, that kind of stuff. It's a fairly basic data set, but where I couldn't really share the original data set because I'd be afraid that some people would be identifiable by name with just a quick Google search. Yeah, so that's kind of the rough description. Maybe one quick question. I mean, you mentioned that this was developed for sensor data and that kind of stuff, where you have enormous data sets and that kind of stuff. Does it make sense to do this also if you have 40 participants? I don't know exactly how the inside of the kind of exactly what the algorithms are of what this package uses. But I'm just curious, is this something where sample size, there must be some sort of restriction, right? Like some lower or upper limit, well, more lower than upper limit, but
I'm not sure. I did some simulations testing different sorts of sample sizes, and I don't remember what my lower limit was, but even something with 20 participants, it'll work fine. The only limitation that I can think of in your scenario is if there is a single outlier. So, for instance, let's say you're working with a population and one person had a very, very high psychopathy score, and then if there is a single outlier, then it's possible to identify that individual. Although I would imagine within your sample, a number of your participants would have very, very high psychopathy scores.
Actually, so the slightly surprising thing is, and I guess somewhat disappointing after we collect the data, is that the psychopathy scores aren't actually that high. Okay. They are pretty normally distributed first, so there isn't any crazy outlier. I mean, it's definitely more psychopathy than the average population, but we don't have whatever, who are the famous psychopaths? I can't think of one right now, I'm blanking. But we don't have someone who did something completely insane. So that should be too much of a problem. But for example, our data set is fairly small. So I think the entire data set is something like 38 people. Okay. And 24 of them, I think, did all tasks.
Okay.
But that shouldn't be a problem then.
Yeah. So I think, I've tested it with samples like that, like with 40 participants. And the two main things you have to watch out for is if there's a single outlier.
Single outlier means in any relevant dimension, or just the one that's identifiable?
One's identifiable. So age is one as well. So say if you're working with a population of people, car accidents, for instance, and there's one person who's age 90, and you're working in a small town, and you know that 90-year-old that was in the car accident. The other thing to also consider is sometimes when you are running the synthetic data sets, by chance, it will happen to reproduce the same values as the real values. This is more likely to happen when you have massive data sets. So if you have 1,000 participants, and you have 5 variables that are limited, age, some psychopathy score, and the highest year of education, for instance, you are bound to have, it's just impossible. You can't create a synthetic data set which isn't going to have somebody that's age 30 that has a high psychopathy score and who has a high school education. So in that case, although the data is scrambled, what's been recommended is to actually leave those people out. Because if somebody actually, even though it's very difficult to identify them, if they were to reread your study, and people who are interested in research tend to do that, then they might look in the data going, hang on, that's me. But you promised me I wouldn't be identified. So in those cases, it's possible. So It really depends on the nature of the data as to whether it's going to happen. But as I mentioned in the primer, it's very important to run those diagnostics to actually see, has any of the same data been matched? So does the synthetic data match the real data? What you can do is you can almost do, it's kind of like synthetic, so it's like p-hacking but for synthetic data. You can set different, you can set different seeds.
For like randomization or?
Yeah. And sometimes if you change your seeds around, then you can avoid this problem. Other times when you're doing the synthetic data analysis, what can change how it's generated is what you set as your first variable. So sometimes if you change around what the first variable you put into the model, then it will change how many people are actually matched. So there's a few different things that you can do, but doing this, as well as actually determining the general utility and the specific utility, it's also very important to do these additional diagnostics in which you actually check, one, is there any big identifiable outliers? One thing that you can do with that is you can potentially do some binning. So rather than treating age as a continuous variable, then you can sort of say everyone above 80, for instance. Not ideal, but if you want to keep everyone in, then you can do that.
I guess it's also maybe important to just remember that this is about the data set you share, not about the analysis you do, right? The binning here is only for sharing the data rather than for actually running an analysis. Yeah.
And I think another consideration as well is a lot of people think, I don't want to share my entire data set. That would be ideal, but I think as a bare minimum, if you can share the data set that's required in order to actually reproduce the analysis, you may have collected 20 variables, but you're only reporting 5. If you're sharing the 5, that's enough. If you want to share the 20, that's also fine. But yeah, those are the main considerations they want to take care of. How's the general utility? How's the specific utility? And am I maintaining the privacy of the participants? So if you're working with a large data set, typically with a large data set, you might see 1% of participants. Like I'm talking like 2,000 people. Of that, maybe like 1 to 2%. There's just no way around it. They're going to be the same values. Then one recommendation would be just to remove those participants. If by removing 1% of your data, you are changing the outcomes of your results, then I wouldn't say your data is very robust to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's very important to be upfront, going, hey, here's the synthetic data. 1% were removed because they were matched case-wise. However, the results are the same. So it's very important to emphasize that you're not aiming to get exactly the same numbers. It's just not possible. But that's not the point. The point is, can you reproduce the overall analysis, and can people get roughly the same outcomes? And if it means you removing some participants for the sake of participant privacy, then I would say go for it. But look, it's hard to. This is just speculation. Sometimes, like with the data sets that I used in the primer, these ones didn't have any matched, I don't think, from memory. But it all depends on the type of data that you have. If you have like reaction time data, where things are from anywhere from sort of like 200 to 1,000 milliseconds, the chances of you having exactly the same thing are going to be very slim. But if you're working with some types of variables, then you're going to get matching. So these are some considerations for when you're actually working with synthetic data sets.
Yeah, I guess in relation to mine and then probably also other people's data, I guess some identifiable variables like age probably are, at least potentially, aren't actually that interesting for your analysis. So, for example, in my case, I don't really care about age, actually. So I could just have the psychopathy and the behavioral things, and then, okay, there's someone with a psychopathy score in and around Hamburg. Then it's, yeah.
Then you're fine. Like maybe you're reporting it as your demographics. Sometimes it might be relevant to include age within a model. I don't know. But in a lot of circumstances, you don't need to include it. So don't.
Or I don't need to include it in the shareable,
exactly,
the shared data set.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess, okay, that's a good point. Yeah, I never thought about that. Okay, but I have one. So in a way, I really like the idea and it sounds really cool, but somehow I'm not entirely convinced it works. Maybe this is just because I haven't looked exactly under the hood of how it works or whatever. But I probably have to ramble a bit to make this question, but I hope I'll make my point. And that is basically, my question is kind of how close the relationship is between your actual data and the synthetic data you create. Because let's say I have 20 variables or something, right? And I want the relationship between all of them to be maintained. It seems to me that beyond a certain level of detail and specificity, there will be only one data set that will match it to that level of detail. Like if you really want to have, I want the correlations between these variables or whatever to be like, until like 5 digits, whatever, like at some point, only one combination of numbers is going to fit that, and that's going to be your original data set. I guess maybe the general logic I'm thinking about is, you might have heard of this, Gremlin Sprite, where you say like, okay, these numbers can only be created by this kind of combination of values. So I'm just curious, it just seems to me that if you have a large amount of variables, that at some point, unless you are pretty vague in terms of how closely you want them to match, that at some point, I'll say the more precise you want the relationships to match, you will converge on your actual data set.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why you always have to check. This is one of those checks that you do within this check of general utility. Firstly, you're looking at the frequencies of, you're sort of comparing, how many males are there in the original and how many males and females are there in the synthetic. But you're also, one other thing you do is you would run scatter plots to actually look at the relationship between,
okay.
So you do scatter plots, and where it may fall down is if you're looking sort of at multi-level stuff, for instance.
Yeah, for example, just anything more than like a correlation or something. Yeah.
Yeah, but typically what you would do is within these examples, you can run you can fit a linear model with a range of coefficients, and including interactions. And in that sense, you can actually see how closely do the coefficients and the variance of those coefficients match between the original and the synthetic data set. And in many examples, they match very closely. So that sort of demonstrates that within the synthetic data sets still do maintain the relationships between variables. So it's one thing to actually say, okay, the means and the standard deviations for all the variables are very similar, but what it also does is it maintains the relationships between the variables. Now, it's important to actually check that this actually occurred, especially for your analyses of interest, which is why you do these tests of specific utility. Now, one thing for these particular tests to work, you need to fit it as a linear model. One thing which blew my mind, which I can't believe I wasn't taught during undergrad, is that every single common statistical test is essentially a linear model. So if you're not already using linear models, you may need to convert your t-tests, for instance, into a linear model. And then within the SynthPop package, then you can basically do those comparisons. You fit a linear model and you can compare the linear model between the original data set and the synthetic data set. So what you're doing is you're just seeing how closely do the coefficients and the variance of the coefficients match up. And it runs a statistical test to actually show you how similar these things are, and you can even report the percentage. So there's you might say there's a 95% or there's a 93% overlap between the synthetic coefficient and the original coefficient. So I think one really important thing to stress is that sometimes it doesn't work just through the nature of the data. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. You can be very upfront in your paper going, we attempted to create synthetic data. The results differ a little bit. However, we're including this in order for interested people to reproduce the analysis. So someone can actually go through and rerun the analysis. You might get different results, but at least people will have a better understanding of what you actually did for your analysis. So these are important things to check. It's not going to work for all sorts of data, but it works for a lot of types of data.
A few points related to what you just said is one is that it seems to me also that just reproducing the summary statistics of your variables is, to be honest with it, if it just did that, I didn't quite see what the point is, because I thought the main kind of advantage is that other people can do exploratory analysis on your data, and that really requires the relationship between variables to be intact, right? That's kind of the crucial thing there.
I still think it can be interesting because that's one way of actually checking, is this data weird, for instance? By looking at that, and just even by looking at the distribution of the data, for instance, you might be very familiar with the type of measure, and you know that this measure always gives you a few outliers. But if someone reports a data set with no outliers, you can go, that's a little bit strange. So it just gives you, even looking at the distribution of the data, the means, the standard deviations, and the presence of outliers, just gives you a better idea without necessarily even running any analysis. I still think that's better than nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I guess this also relates to where I talked to Joe Hilgard about his Zhang affair, and where he got data that was just a cube like the just really weird looking data, where based on that you basically say like no one collected this data. This isn't real.
And when you see the synthetic data, because it roughly approximates the real data, you can still see this is weird. This is weird. Data does not behave this way. So it's just even for that, it can be quite useful.
One thing that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I put links and I put like references in the description and links to everything we talk about. And you mentioned this, you alluded to a blog post with linear models. I put that in there too, in case people were wondering what that's about.
It's such a good blog post.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I saw it yesterday. I watched your what's it called, like Riot Science or something like that.
Oh, yep.
There's something like a talk on synthetic data sets by you on there, and you mentioned that, and then I had to look it up, but I haven't read it yet.
It's really good. I think the other thing I want to mention is that when it comes to sharing data and sharing analyses, things like R is fantastic because it's accessible and it's very easy to share scripts, but packages and R versions change over time. So something that you share now, it gets a little bit depressing to think about, but something that you share now may be very difficult to do in 10 years' time because all these things update. One thing I did with this paper was I shared a reproducible Docker image of my analysis, which basically...
Docker image is what?
Yeah, so this is basically it's like a container, like it's a self-contained... I'm probably explaining this very poorly. It's a self-contained file which allows you to rerun the analysis based on the environment which I saved it in. So when I wrote the paper, it was a particular R version, and all the packages I used were a particular version. I put together this sort of self-contained bit of code, which means that in your browser, you can rerun the analysis, and in 10 years' time, it's going to behave exactly the same. So this is hosted on my GitHub. eLife also saves a copy in case my GitHub explodes, for instance. And then what it means is you click on this link, it takes about sort of, maybe a minute to load, and it loads up RStudio server on the web, and you can rerun it exactly how I did it on my computer. And it's future-proof, essentially. And it's a really nice thing that I'm looking at doing for more of my papers, so that, on top of sharing your code, which I think is important, it helps future-proof your code as well. And then this pops up in the browser. You can see it recreates my environment. You can see all the packages that I use, all the files that are there, and you can rerun all the analysis that's explained there.
Yeah, can we get maybe just a minute about that topic more? Because this is something I've heard about before, but I don't really, to be fair, I don't use R. So that's maybe the first reason why. Like if I use MATLAB, maybe that's pretty straightforward.
You can do the same. I think if you do it in Octave, you can do something similar.
But I guess I'm just curious, like for people who are using R, what are some maybe like educational resources or you can use, or what are some good tools you use for doing that? Yeah, for this kind of archiving of the actual R version you're using.
I used a package called Binder.
That's what Binder's for. Okay.
Yeah. No, is it called Binder?
Or I've heard the name before, but because I don't use R, I don't really pay that close attention.
I have to look back at that. Was it Binder? No, I used a hole punch. My bad. That's the package. So a hole punch, it basically does everything in the background for you. You have to, it doesn't take very long. It's only a few lines of script, and it will do all the work for you and help you create this self-contained package. And that's what I did for this particular paper. It's not hard, but it's not easy. It took me a little bit of fiddling around, but like an afternoon sort of thing, getting it all together and getting it ready. But once it worked beautifully. So Hole Punch is the name.
And then what you get out of this, like a zip file that you can upload to GitHub, or what exactly is the kind of data you get out?
So more or less these files live on GitHub, and then it's sort of run. I'm not entirely sure how it works, to be honest, because it was all very new to me. But the files live on GitHub, and then you sort of run it from there. But yeah, it's run within Binder, and then you can see all your stuff there. But you can do this with R, you can do this with Python, you can do this with Octave, as far as I know as well. So it's quite flexible. It's language agnostic.
Yeah, I might have to do this with Python soon. But actually, whilst we're talking about programming languages, one of the reasons I'm hesitant to use the synthpop package is because I don't really use R. I have used R before, but basically now all my analysis in MATLAB, and in the future, especially for online data collection, I'll be using Python. I have to learn some JavaScript. I hate programming. It's the least favorite part of my job. I'm not really looking forward to learning R so I can use this one package or make some nice figures.
This is very straightforward compared to other packages. If you're doing sort of basic synth pop, it's literally a few lines of code. So compared to other packages, it's very straightforward to use.
So I have no excuse.
No excuse. And the documentation, is very good. And there's a lot of support online. But compared to other packages, it's very nicely written and it's relatively straightforward to use. So I would think that, even someone who's sort of got a basic familiarity with R will be able to use it no problems.
Damn it.
No
really have no excuse. But this is one of those things with I'm all for open science and reproducibility and all this kind of stuff, but sometimes another thing to do.
But I think as well, something that a lot of people forget is if you're doing relatively straightforward analysis, there are tools like JASP and Jamovi in which you can do exactly the same thing, in which you can share you can run your analysis and share your scripts. And you can share your JASP and Jamovi file, and anyone can open that up and reproduce what you've done. But that's assuming you're doing
not for critical data, or not critical, but what's the word? Confidential data.
No, exactly. So if you're willing to share the data, that is, then you can use that. But yeah, if you want to use SynthPop, then I actually toyed around with the idea of writing a Shiny app for SynthPop. Then I realized that there's potential privacy concerns because the Shiny app has to be hosted somewhere and people are putting their confidential data into the Shiny app.
Right.
So I was about halfway through making it and I'm like, oh crap, that's a really bad problem. And I didn't know how to solve that. So I sort of abandoned it. But using the package within R, if you're a beginner, you can do it.
I mean, to be fair, there's like a question that's always tricky, like which programming language to learn. Because then it seems like R can do a lot of things that other things can't do. One thing that to me sounds very interesting is this whole idea of Markdown, where it automatically, you write, as far as I understand, you write your paper in R or whatever, and then it automatically puts the results of your variables in. So if you, end up changing something about it, then it automatically changes the slightly changed output. That does sound really cool, and that alone is for me almost worth considering doing my analysis in R.
It's very cool. I've played around with it, and it's like magic because invariably you are gonna, reviewers gonna suggest additional analyses. You might want to do different analyses, and it reduces the chances of you making an error because sometimes you're running your analysis and you're copy and pasting between your Word document or between your LaTeX document, and it's just human error. But doing it this way, it's it's cool. It's very cool. I've played it. I haven't actually, maybe I've done one paper like this, but it's,
so you don't actually, I assumed you would just use this all the time.
No, look, I don't know. When it comes to writing stuff, I find it almost distracting because you have your R Markdown and then I write a sentence. I'm like, okay, I want to see how that renders. Press the button. It takes 3 seconds to render and it just gets in the way of my writing. And also a lot of my collaborators don't use R or they don't use LaTeX or whatever.
Can't you export it? But
it's a pain. So you can export it into Word. It doesn't always work, but then it seems like a pain to write it, export it, get your collaborators to make the changes and then import it back in again. Yeah. So one thing that I have been using for doing this is this service called Simul, Simul. It's like GitHub for your Word documents, and it's super easy for you to actually share your Word documents. So you upload your document to Simul. I write it, and then I invite my collaborators, and then they can access it. And what you can do is people can work on it in real time, and then you can actually version control everything. And then say you have 3 people working on it. Once they're finished working on it, you can then merge those documents together. But the good thing is, it doesn't actually create more work for your collaborators because all they're doing is opening the Word document, working on it as normal, and then saving it, and that's it. That's what I found has worked the best when working with collaborators. Sometimes if it's just a paper with me and my PhD student, we might just write it in Overleaf, for instance. Other times we just do it in Word. It just depends on who I'm working with. But when it comes to these bigger papers, when I've got 15 co-authors, for instance,
okay,
I think some people are just like, it's very funny seeing people raise their noses. Oh, you use Word. Oh, I'm like, mate, you obviously don't collaborate with people, many people because a lot of people just don't know how to use these other tools. And sometimes I feel I was working with a LaTeX document yesterday, and I just wanted to move a box to the bottom of the page, and I was 40 minutes in Googling, and I'm like, oh, stuff this. If this is Word, you just move it. So look, there are pros and cons, but I think some people are very software hipsters when it comes to just design software. It can be very frustrating.
Yeah, no, I mean I just literally last week, we published a preprint that had some mathematics in it, so I needed to use Overleaf. Or, I don't know, maybe I could have done it in Word, but didn't seem like it was a good idea. And I did it on Overleaf, and, I love that you can really make it look the way you want it to look and put things there. And I'm really happy with the way the preprint looks, but might have been quicker to just write everything in Word and then copy and paste it over.
Yeah.
Because I think Word is still, despite all the criticisms, I think the best way to write something. Yeah, there's all these fancy tools you can use, but I think, I don't know, at least for the way I write something, having a folder on your desktop and a Word document, a few Word documents, is usually for me by far the most efficient way of actually writing something. But I haven't written something with 15 collaborators yet, and just having I've had some stuff where we were two people were in parallel working on the same document, and that just was the most annoying thing ever.
Of course, there's also Google Docs as a way of collaborating as well, which is I use it sometimes. But yeah, it's not bad. I still, just the way that track changes work, I still prefer Word. But other documents that with other people, I use Google Docs as well. So it's a bit of a mix. But look, every 6 months it's always different. Sometimes I'm Overleaf all the way. Other times I get frustrated with it, and then I'm back to Word. But now it really just comes down to who am I working with on this particular paper. If I know I'm going to send it to collaborators who aren't comfortable with LaTeX, then I'll just do it in Word. If it's just me in my lab, then I might do it. I might do it in Overleaf. It really just depends.
How does I know Overleaf has this. So I'm just using the free version, and I used it basically to write it, and then I exported it as PDF and sent it to my supervisor. But they do have a collaborate function in there, right?
Yeah. So
is that what you use? And if so, how well does it work?
It works. I still think the track changing just works better in Word, because if you have a lot of comments, it can get quite jumbled very quickly. But of course, you can do the same sort of thing. You can suggest edits. You can track changes. You can version control those edits, and you can also write comments. And then you can also have. It's a nice feature. I don't even know if Word has this, but there's a general chat feature. So as well as talking about the paper, directly, about sections, and there's also a chat feature as well. So you have sort of discussions about the paper within the paper too. So it works well, but the only downside is once you start having a lot of collaborators with a lot of comments, it can be a lot harder. Word does a pretty decent job when you've got comments everywhere, but Overleaf can sometimes get a little bit tricky to use. It just depends on the project.
Okay. I mean, I guess in some sense for me it's pretty easy, because most of the papers I do the work, and then we might have collaborators I help with one or another thing. Basically, I write the thing, which I guess makes it a lot easier to just write the thing, because I can just do however I want it. And just despite my strong distaste of most Microsoft things, Word is actually pretty useful. I have to admit, it is still the best way.
But Word Online, I think, is frustrating. I've
never used that.
Yeah. It tries to be Google Docs in terms of its collaboration, but it's clunky. I don't know. I'm not a fan of maybe it's changed recently, but it feels very beta-ish how it works. Cursors will just jump and move everywhere, but normal Word, I don't know. It's just it's easy to bash on Microsoft, but
and I will.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got through this via R. Okay, yeah. Somehow it's funny. I just assumed that. I don't know why. It's really funny. In somewhere again, you said that you. Actually, can you confirm this? Is it true that you basically used SPSS for your entire PhD? or that you only started using R in your postdoc or programming?
Yeah.
Or
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
Because just for context, I've been listening to your podcast since, I don't know, like episode 60 or something like that.
okay,
I'm not
nice.
sure. And for me, you and James are these two people who are, really into open science and reproducibility and all this stuff. So I just assumed you, like, I don't know, grew up coding or something like
No,
that.
not at all. Look, James still uses Excel for a lot of his analysis. Yeah.
Oh, really? I actually, I found out, I'm not joking, about 3 months ago that Excel is basically more than just a spreadsheet. I thought it was just like a place where you can like put data. I didn't realize that you could actually like do stuff with it.
Oh yeah, it's like it's really powerful for in certain contexts. But yeah, look, I used SPSS because like I had heard of R during my PhD. I graduated in 2013. And back then, like I didn't know anyone using R. Of course, I knew a few people using MATLAB, and R was just this thing that I'm like, why would you ever do code when you can just point and click? Point and click is so much easier. But literally, I had one of my papers during my postdoc. I needed to do, I think, mixed linear models, and you couldn't do that in SPSS at the time. So I'm like, gee, I better learn this R. I better learn this R thing. And then,
well, that's good. You didn't go like, I'll just have a different experimental question then.
No, I knew this is what I had to do. But the thing which really got me into R was meta-analysis. Using the metaphor package within meta-analysis was my gateway drug.
Okay, just briefly, I've never run a meta-analysis. I think I always also assumed you did R and that kind of stuff very early on because you did meta-analysis in your PhD, right?
I did, but I didn't. I used different software.
Okay, I thought well, yeah, I don't know. I just assumed you used R. Okay.
So I'd use point and click software, and the thing with this point and click software is like it's not incorrect. Like the software gives you the right numbers, but the flexibility that you get with R and the fact that you can actually share your analyses makes it a lot better. And the thing I love about meta-analysis is that you are working on public data. So you have absolutely no excuse not to share your data. So whenever I'm reviewing a meta-analysis and I'm like, I want to understand what this is doing, I always ask the reviewers, share your data. And they can never say no because they have no excuse. The only possible excuse you can have is if you're somehow working with doing a mega-analysis, for instance, where you're doing sort of individual, you're doing a meta-analysis based on individual data points. But the majority of meta-analysis is done on publicly available summary statistics. So there's no excuse. So if you're doing this based on proprietary point and click software, you might share the data, but I still have very little idea of how you did your analysis because people are very bad at sharing their methods. So unless they did a run-of-the-mill meta-analysis with all the common defaults, and even those things can change from lab to lab, it's very difficult. But if you're using R as well as sharing the data, you can share your scripts and then it's much easier. But doing and learning meta-analysis within R, it's worth it alone. So if you're doing meta-analysis, it's absolutely worth learning it so you can do that. Because there's the metaphor package, which has like some of the best documentation out there. But there's also other meta-analysis packages that you can use there. And it's totally worth it. But yeah, look, I only picked it up during my postdoc, and also it was from a lot of frustration from licensing from SPSS. Like, you own the thing because you're part of the institution, but then there's licensing problems. The software takes like 5 minutes to load. And through that kind of frustration, I'm like, well, I'm paying you my institution's paying you for a license, but you don't want me to use your software. And it's with that, I went to R, but look, there's nothing wrong with SPSS. It's much more difficult to share. And look, everyone's like, oh, the syntax. No one shares their syntax. You almost never see it. But with R, it just makes it a lot easier. But yeah, this is a sort of a recent thing that I've been getting into. And I think when it comes to open science and reproducibility, it's very important to stress that you don't need to adopt all these things all at once. There are so many things you need to get your head around. Open data, open scripts, preprints, pre-registration. And people think, oh, this is a lot of stuff and I can't learn it all for this paper. I don't know what to do. Just do one thing. For your next paper, go, I'm going to share my scripts. For your next paper, think about, okay, this is how I'm going to do my pre-registration. Bit by bit, if you're picking up these skills, that's totally fine. Rather than sort of thinking, I can't do all these things at once, because it does. It's a valuable skill. And the great thing is seeing more and more job advertisements that are saying open science and reproducibility is valued. And it's valued because it takes time to learn these things, and it takes time to learn these things. So you shouldn't feel this pressure of, I need to do this, all these things for the next paper. It's difficult. Just do one thing at a time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've basically had to do all of this in my PhD. And I mean, there are other reasons why I guess some of my projects aren't published yet, but some of them may be more related to me. But one reason is also that I spend a lot of time, reading up on all this stuff. Like why to visualize your data in all these different ways and not just use bar plots and, like basic stuff like that. And there's like a million things like that. And I agree that, in the same way that it's a lot of fun to bash Word or to bash ISPSS or whatever. Yeah, that's maybe fun to do, but maybe not always the best way to actually get people to adopt it.
Yeah, shame isn't a great motivator, and a lot of people are very discouraged. They open up Twitter and they see people, look, and I'm going to admit, I have been that person in the past who has sort of somewhat unfairly bashed SPSS. And in retrospect, I realized that is not the best way to go. But the best way to go is actually pointing people to resources and how to actually learn these things, but of course, like it makes it very difficult to share your data. That I'm not going to apologize for. It makes it very difficult to share your scripts if you don't have, like, what one person actually did for a paper I was reviewing, share their syntax. And I'm like, I have to load SPSS. I haven't done this in such a long time because they're doing everything right. But at the same time, I think I said in my review, well, I have the SPSS, but a lot of readers don't. So if you really want to make this more reproducible, then really strongly consider doing this sort of thing in R or in JASP or in Jamovi so that people can learn it. But look, it's just this snobbery with different software packages and the ways of doing things. As long as you're not making any errors, then I think it's fine. But some software packages, you're going to be more likely to make the errors. So yeah, it's important to make that distinction.
And I guess it's also more of a long-term versus short-term thinking, right? I mean, I think, sure, it took me, I feel like I only really, after about 1.5 years of my PhD of really programming relatively frequently, that I actually started to feel comfortable with it. And now I can, do my analysis without thinking about it too much.
Yeah.
Obviously, I have to search stuff, but it's now fairly easy. There's a startup cost for that. But then again, now it's super easy to run an analysis and show people what I did and change small things. And I think if anyone who wants to stay in academia for at least a few years, I think it's probably a worth investment. It's
a skill you need to learn. And even if I think it's also important to recognize that for a lot of people, academia isn't the way to go forever. And people want stuff in industry, and in industry, Python especially is within data science is very well valued. R as well to a lesser extent. So picking up these skills is going to make you more valuable outside, both within academia, but also outside. And, there are still a lot of departments that are still teaching SPSS. Like I said, you're still going to get the same results, but more and more departments are switching across to R. And people sort of assume, the students are going to hate this, but it's a massive assumption. I've seen survey after survey of students that are like, this is super cool, and really actually enjoying learning how to do R.
I have to admit, though, I think I kind of agree with the, let's say, intuition or assumption that students would hate it, because I probably would have hated it. Because I think, this is in part why I think also I'd spent so much time during my PhD in particular relearning stats and all that kind of stuff, is because during my undergrad I was like, well, is it significant? Is it below or above 0.5? Like, I don't care about it. Like, just tell me what it is, and then that's all I need to know. And only now, once I actually go but what do my results really mean? And all this kind of, once you have to really think about it, then you go I think I have to learn stats properly.
Yeah.
But I think I'm always also the bad example to extrapolate from, because I think I'm just not someone who really likes sitting in class and doing what I'm told. So maybe, we had this course we taught on the weekend. I was really surprised that the students were engaged. It's like, wait, they actually did what I asked them to do. What's wrong? What's wrong with you people? Yeah. But maybe that's just me. Anyway, wait, I just found a link between synthetic datasets and science communication.
Let's do it.
Okay, here's my very elegant transition. I hope I'm getting this right. You broadcast yourself writing the primer, right?
That's
Was it that paper?
That's the one.
Sweet. So I have to admit, I haven't watched that yet. Although I will be. I want to see like kind of what you're doing there, what that's like.
You're going to be sweating and swearing as I make all these errors.
Sounds great. But kind of, you're doing quite a lot of science communication, right? And this is one example of it.
Yeah.
And I try to kind of, before I kind of do these interviews, I look at like what can I find about the guests, and I interview a lot of people who have basically no online presence, at least that I can find. And for you, I found. You want me to read the list?
Oh, no.
I found. Okay, then I'm going to do it. I found Twitter, 3 podcasts. You've obviously been guests on other podcasts, a YouTube account, a Medium blog, a separate blog called dsquintana.blog, then your website, dsquintana.com, university website, LinkedIn, Google Scholar, GitHub, ResearchGate, Frontiers Loop, Instagram, and lastly, I'm subscribed to your newsletter. For about the last year, I think I've received 1 email. What's going on with your newsletter?
I have been a little bit slack on the newsletter.
But it was a very long newsletter. It seemed like, I was like, I also, because I think I hadn't received an email for like a few months, I'd completely forgotten I subscribed. And so I was like, Dan Quintana's emailing me. Why that? And then it's like, the newsletter. That's
right.
And then there was just a wall of like, here's all the stuff I published. But anyway, so kind of what's maybe as a kind of bigger picture behind like all of these things, right? Is there kind of like one, not like a specific reason for why you do all of this, but yeah, this is a lot of work, right? I do 1 podcast and this is a lot of work. And you do all this other stuff too. So kind of why?
It's not as much work as you would think, because a lot of the stuff that I do, I repurpose for different mediums. So for instance, what I might do is if I'm doing a presentation, I'll record that as a video. I'll record that as a YouTube video, and then I'll post it on my YouTube, and then I can strip the audio and post that as a podcast. And then I can take the best bits and best ideas and turn that into a blog post. I can take photos during the presentation and post that on Twitter and on Instagram or on TikTok or whatever. And
you have TikTok? I didn't know.
Yeah. That's one thing that you missed. I thought that's what you were going to finish with.
I think I also missed Facebook. I don't know if you have that. I don't have Facebook, so
I do have a public-facing Facebook account. And look, the other thing is people like reading information in different ways. I'm a podcast guy. I almost never use YouTube for learning stuff. I would much rather learn about a thing via a blog post, but people like taking in information in different ways. That's why I've sort of spread myself across these different platforms. The place that I spend the most is Twitter, because that gives you the most bang for your buck. Facebook, I don't like, because the way the algorithm is, you basically have to pay money in order to get yourself in front of people regularly. Unless they're already subscribed to your page, getting organic reach, which is basically reaching people without paying for advertising, is extremely difficult. Whereas getting that reach on Twitter is much easier, in that all it takes is one person to see your tweet and to retweet it, and off it goes into the stratosphere. That stuff rarely happens on Facebook. So that's why I like Twitter in that respect. But look, all this stuff comes down to the fact that the way that academia works now is there's gatekeeping everywhere. There's gatekeeping in terms of you submitting your paper and in getting it published in journals. When it comes to you talking about your research with traditional media outlets, whether it's TV, whether it's radio, whether it's the newspapers, there's a lot of gatekeeping going on, which can make it very difficult to get your work out there. If you're already famous, it's very easy. You have a new paper, you can call your contact at the newspaper, and away you go. If your mentor is famous, for instance, that can also really help. And if you can get very lucky in the peer review lottery and get a paper in that fancy journal, then a lot of people will start paying attention. But other than that, it's very difficult for an early career researcher to get themselves known otherwise. But with social media, you can get around that gatekeeping. If you have ideas that you want to put out there, traditionally you would need to use traditional media, or you would need to publish papers. But with social media, you can get around that. You can start blogging, you can start pre-printing, you can start talking about your ideas, and there is none of the gatekeeping that you do see with the traditional journals and the traditional media. And there's just fantastic opportunities as well to learn new stuff. We spoke about before me relearning statistics in my postdoc. A lot of the stuff that I learned was from finding stuff on Twitter, was from asking questions on experts on Twitter. How do I do this thing?
I found so much about open science on Twitter. I think for that is especially useful here.
It's hugely
useful. I hate Twitter. I don't really use it much. And I've still found so much about open science on it. Yeah.
Even like following certain accounts or asking questions, you can find a lot of stuff. And also just for those connections that you get. I have a young family. It's very difficult for me to travel overseas for a long amount of time. When I was without kids, it's very easy to sort of go to different conferences and meet people. And I also recognize that for a lot of people, they don't have the resources to be able to do that, to be able to travel. But with social media, with Twitter in particular, then you can get those opportunities for actually meeting new people and networking with new people. I've lost count of the amount of papers, collaborations that have come about because of Twitter, because of talking with people there. Invitations for doing talks that never would have happened otherwise because people have heard the podcast, because people have seen me on Twitter talking about stuff.
Hello, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And because we always see from all these conferences we go to, it's like, oh, that old white guy, it's like did a keynote at the last 3 conferences. The reason people do that is that people are very risk averse when it comes to choosing their speakers. And they're like, well, I saw that guy speaking at the last one. Why don't I invite for the next one? But if you have a podcast, if you have a voice within social media, then people can get familiar with you and then you can become the safe option and they can contact you going, hey, we want you to speak at this conference. And then things kind of snowball from there. So I like it because it is a great leveler in many respects and it levels the playing field, especially for early career researchers. And there's a lot of pushback from some senior academics going, oh, I don't like all this discussion on Twitter, all this critical discussion. Yeah, of course you don't like it because previously exactly. you couldn't get challenged. You write a letter to the editor, but the editor's your mate and they're not going to publish the paper. But on Twitter, look, I'm not going to say there's a lot of problems. It's not this perfect paradise and there's a lot of stuff that can go on there. But at the same time, there is a lot of benefits when it comes to sharing your work, learning from other people and building those contacts. And personally, it's been great for my career. And it's just one we were speaking before about, using R and as a new tool in your toolkit. I think social media should be something in every researcher's toolkit as a way to talk about their research, as a way to meet new people. It should be something that everyone is taught because it's such a fantastic resource, I think.
Yeah, again, I have a bunch of questions based on a few things you mentioned. First is maybe a bit specific, but how do you ask a question on Twitter that gets lots of response? For example, I created a Twitter account when I had my first, I don't know, like half a year ago, whatever. I think I have 20 followers. I think I'm an influencer now. I think I have 20 followers on Twitter. So if I post something with a question, well, I don't because I'm assuming no one's going to respond because there's only 20 people who can even see my tweets unless like someone with lots of followers happens to retweet it, but that's pretty unlikely. If you have a question about something, how do you ask that on Twitter if you don't already have a big audience?
There's 2 ways. You can either tag experts. Of course, don't spam them. But if there's an expert in the area that you think can answer your question, it's incredible. For me, if there's an academic that I know is active on Twitter and I want to ask them the question, I'll always contact them on Twitter rather than email them. Email is just associated with drudgery. Twitter usually is a bit more fun. And these academics are much more faster to respond, whether it's a public message or whether it's a private direct message. I'll always use that as a way of contacting academics. But so one way is tagging someone who might have that expertise. Other way is by using certain hashtags. This doesn't always work. But for instance,
I was going to ask, does that work? I don't know. I've never looked for hashtags or anything. So
I find that for rstats, for R, if you use the rstats hashtag, there are some bots which tend to retweet that stuff and increase your reach. For me, I've just seen as well with a lot of other people who've had success with actually using the rstats hashtag. For instance, some research communities have their own hashtags that can help. There's other ones, for instance, academic chatter is a good one. So people who have, within their PhDs, if they tag or hashtag academic chatter, then other people are sort of looking at these questions. I'm not going to pretend that your questions are always going to be answered if you're doing a thing. A lot of people, I was doing a Twitter workshop in Germany. So, where was it? Leipzig, I think. Anyway, And I'm like, anyone who has less than 20 followers, who has less than 50 followers, and one person with their hand up, I'm like, we're going to ask a question. We're going to use the right hashtags. And by the end of this session, you're going to get a lot of answers. And I did it. We did it. And he got no answers. Like, it was if it worked, it would have been incredible. So these things obviously don't always work. So I think what would be more successful is to tag 1 or 2 experts in the area. It sometimes happens to me. People have meta-analysis questions and sometimes I get tagged. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know, and I'll retweet the question. Other times, look, if someone can answer your question within the space of a tweet, the likelihood of them answering you is very high.
Right. Yeah.
So if it's literally, one thing I like using Twitter for is if I'm working on different scientific figures, I'm like, okay, A or B, what do you think? And then people will just vote on that. Or they'll go, oh, A is good, but you should consider using different shading, for instance. So there's different ways that you can do this. But hashtags and direct tagging people are 2 ways that you can get your answers, your questions answered.
Okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, as you said, it's not about, there's no guarantee for any of this working, but I guess this maybe sounds very grim, but I just don't think if I just retweet something, there's going to be any response because, as I said, I have 20 followers like this, that if I just do that, basically ask a question, there's just going to be a response. But with this, there's at least a chance then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add to what you said earlier, that this kind of getting yourself out there and sharing your ideas and that kind of stuff, that's particularly useful for early career researchers. Just to highlight, I think it's especially useful right now during the pandemic. I mean, you mentioned conferences. So far, 2/3 of my PhD have been during a pandemic. And basically, as soon as I had something that I could have shown, pandemic. And there are, I guess, still like online stuff, like online conferences or whatever. But yeah, I think especially like during this kind of thing when, this isn't specifically why I started the podcast. I mean, it's coincidence that it was around the time of the pandemic, but, I get to meet every other week on average, like someone new, like you, for example, now who I wouldn't, maybe we would have met otherwise, because of Christoph, but, many of my guests I would never have met otherwise. Yeah, I guess podcast is maybe asking quite a lot because that is a fair amount of work, having some sort of podcast, but yeah, Twitter definitely seems like something that is doable. Hey, okay, so here's one question about Twitter just specifically, which is I find it annoying. I'm not sure why. What's the mindset I could have to start engaging more with it? I don't know. It feels to me still like an obligation. I guess it is an opportunity, but it still feels like, like it would be good to tweet more so I can have more following. So in case I have when I have a paper, more people see it, but it doesn't really feel like something right now that I really enjoy doing.
It's really what you make it. So, and you don't have to follow scientists as well. Like if there's other people within different spheres, you can follow them to make it more interesting. If there's something that you just can't stand hearing about, if you can't stand hearing about cryptocurrency, you can mute certain words, and tweets with those certain words will never pop up in your feed. So there are ways of tailoring the experience to make it fun. And look, for me, the moment it doesn't become fun, I'll stop using it. Like, it shouldn't feel like drudgery. Like, I don't have it, so I'm like, I need to tweet today. It's just one of those things that I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna share what I'm doing. I never think about have some sort of tweeting strategy, not at all. I'm just sharing what I'm doing. And if someone is tweeting stuff I'm interested in, I just stop following them, like, or mute them. There's no hard feelings there. And I'm sure people unfollow me all the time, and that's fine. Like, that's just the way it is. But it should be fun. And one way to do that is just following the right accounts, I think, as well. And as soon as it stops becoming fun, I think about my use. I go through some periods where I delete it from my phone if I need to really.
So you have it on your phone, okay?
Sorry,
I was curious. So you have it on your phone. I was curious whether it's a good idea to have Twitter on your phone.
It can be a bit more distracting. But for me, I go through some periods where I delete it from my phone, and then I can only access it on a desktop, which means I'm using it less. And
that's what I have.
Yeah, it's completely up to you as to how you use it. I wrote a book called Twitter for Scientists. It's a free book, so I'm not sort of making any money from plugging it. And it goes through step by step how to use it. And one thing that I added to this book is a Twitter bootcamp. It's a 30-day thing where I give prompts suggestions of what people can tweak, because sometimes people are just like, I just don't know what to talk about. But within these prompts, you can actually go through, and every day there's 2 different options, and you can try. It's a way of sort of getting some momentum there.
Make a guess until what point I followed your book.
Did you stop after the first chapter?
No, until it got practical.
There we go.
Until I actually had to do something.
Chapter 2 then, yeah.
Really?
No, I think...
No, I read everything basically. I basically read the entire thing, but then when it came to your boot camp, I was like, okay. That seems like work.
You almost finished it, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so look, it should be fun. Other thing as well is like people are...
So can I just add one thing to your book? I think I mean, whether you call it a book or not doesn't matter, but I think it's quite short, right? It's not like a book that you spend like 5 hours reading. It's like half an hour or something, right?
Yeah.
Like it's you could have called it like blog posts basically, but
it started being a blog post, and then I realized there were so many sections that I converted it into an ebook. Yeah.
Just so people know, like this is not like something you know that's going to be a lot of work to read.
No, like half an hour, if that.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is the good thing is there are different types of social media that you can use based on what you're interested in and what you like doing. Some people hate video. Some people love doing video. If that's the case, then Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Some people prefer, such as yourself, podcasts. I love podcasts. I think they're fantastic. And but other people just can't stand the sound of their own voice. So then maybe blogging is a bit better for them. So there are different mediums and that you can use that's sort of better suited to what you prefer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that is one of the really cool things. Like whatever you prefer doing, there is a medium that probably only uses that specific way of communicating. Yeah. And I guess like even if you say like I like writing, but I don't really have the time to write long posts, well then use Twitter.
Twitter's yeah.
Maybe to kind of maybe get a bit more toward podcasts. I mean, you mentioned you don't like hearing the sound of your own voice, but as you said in your blog post on starting a podcast or whatever, is there anyone who really likes listening to their voice in the beginning, at least?
In the beginning, like you learned, I think, at least for me, like I've learned to tolerate it. I'm like, okay, that's just how I sound. That's just how it is.
Yeah, exactly.
But at first, it's always very jarring. But I think, it's an experience that everyone has.
How long did that take for you? Because I have this real, I mean, I found it so difficult in the beginning. In part, this kind of, hearing your own voice and going, what? That's what I sound like. And secondly, also, I mean, what I just found difficult was this idea, like, this is final now. Like this episode is out there.
Yeah.
And this is the way I sound. But I was really surprised to find that it took me maybe, I mean, I don't know exactly when, but at least like after episode 10 or something like that. So mine are like, on average, maybe like 70, 80 minutes long. So it's, I listen to my voice a lot when I have to edit it. But around that time, I realized like, wait a minute, I'm not cringing anymore when I start speaking. I'm not sure I've got much better, but I'm not cringing at it anymore. How long did you take to kind of get used to it? Because since then, I've basically been like, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah, about the same, about 5 or 10 episodes. After that, I'm kind of like, this is how it is. This is what everyone experiences. And now I'm just used to it. I've done a lot of editing. I've edited myself. I can't even imagine how many hours. So you just get used to it.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really cool thing. I think this, I mean, I guess, not liking listening to your own voice is one reason. Of course, there's many other reasons why podcasting might not be the right thing. I think, as I think most people are aware, it's probably easier if you're a native speaker.
It makes a huge difference.
Just as I said that, I think I stumbled over the word native speaker. But although for me it's bad because I'm only half a native speaker, basically, because I spent most of my life in Germany. Mm-hmm. And depending on who I'm talking to and who I spoke to before I started recording, the German can start to creep in. Although I think my English is strong enough that people just think I'm South African then.
Okay.
Because you have this like weird Germanic British vibe, which then apparently sounds South African. But that's another thing that could be difficult.
But I quite like, I mean, a lot of people, you mentioned before this idea of it's final, it's out there. But one of the reasons that I really like podcasts is it gives you the opportunity to get into some nuance. It's very difficult for people to take you out of context. It's very easy for people to take it out of context on Twitter, for a blog post, it's a screenshot. Look at what this person said. We've done 145 episodes, and only once out of all that time, after almost 1 million downloads, has someone gone to the trouble of capturing the audio from one thing that we said. We're like, these guys are nasty. I think
what was it?
We were talking about how somebody disagreed with that there was an error in the paper, but it was maths, and I'm like, you can't argue with maths. Like 2 + 2 = 4, and we were like, oh, it's maths, and we started laughing, and then they took that as a way of us, oh, look at these guys making fun of papers type thing. But that was kind of within a wider conversation of people who were just disagreeing that the papers were wrong, but they were wrong. And yeah, one person's done that in that entire thing. Whereas with Twitter, it's very easy for people to take you out of context. When you're writing, it's very easy to do that. But with podcasts, you get that nuance, and people. Yeah,
it's work to take someone out of context in a podcast. Yeah,
it takes a lot of work.
Really have to you have to really put in effort.
This person worked really hard to do that. So I like that. You can really talk about certain ideas, and I think it's much easier in writing a blog post, because with a blog post, I think people have a lot more grace when you're talking, because conversation, people know what conversations are like, and people know that conversations aren't perfect. And people meander, they get to a point, they change ideas. You don't do that when you're writing.
Well, you could start like that, but you should probably edit, yeah.
Exactly. So there's the expectation to edit and have this polished, coherent piece. But with podcasting, in a lot of sense, you're thinking out loud, and people are totally okay with you thinking out loud, and you even changing your mind mid-sentence. It's totally fine. And in that respect, it takes, of course, editing takes a little bit of time, but I think it takes, all things equal, I think it's much quicker and a much better use of time to podcast than just a blog. I do blog from time to time, especially when it's a more technical thing. But when it talks about me sharing, when I'm thinking about sharing my ideas, much better on a podcast, much easier.
Yeah, that's true. Even if I say like editing takes a lot of time, it's like, well, writing takes a lot of time too.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, actually compared to that, it's not that much. Yeah, maybe as a, let's say, maybe there's some listeners who are interested in starting their own podcast. Before we get to that, I have one question. So there's a phrase that is, everyone has their podcast these days. Do you know anyone who has a podcast? Because I don't. The only people I know have a podcast, I know through my podcast.
Very, very few people. There's one person in our department, and she does a psychiatry podcast, which is great. I think they have like an episode a month, and they just talk about issues within psychiatry. It's Norwegian podcast, and there's people sort of loosely connected, and of course, but most of the people that I know with podcasts, I know via Twitter, for instance. There are other podcasts that sort of do similar stuff than what we're doing with Everything Hertz when it comes to methodology and reproducibility, as well. Within sort of my workplace is just maybe, just like one person. I keep telling people this is a great opportunity to do all this kind of stuff. But it's not everyone's cup of tea. I wish more people did it though. Like honestly, exactly. Whenever I hear new science podcast, I'm like, yes, let's grow this community. I'm a bit biased because I love podcasts myself. Like when I'm commuting, when I'm taking the baby for a walk, one headphone in, and that's how I can keep on top of things. And you hear some really interesting stuff.
If the baby's crying, 2 headphones in.
Yeah, 2 headphones.
But so actually, just out of curiosity, who do you like listening to, or what are some kind of podcasts that you really enjoy?
I enjoy Quantitude.
Other than your own.
I listen to it far too much in the edits. I'm really enjoying Quantitude.
What's that about?
So that's quantitative statistics. The hosts are fantastic, and that's got a really good production value. Like they spend a lot of time. It sounds corny, but like sound effects, and like if they like reference a movie, they'll actually take the audio, like a 5-second audio clip from the movie. Really, really cool stuff. Very highly produced, highly polished, and very, very knowledgeable guys. I think the first podcast that I really got into for science podcasts was Very Bad Wizards, which is sort of psychology.
Sorry, what about
Very, Very Bad Wizards?
Oh, Very Bad Wizards. Okay.
Yes. It's a mixture of sort of psychology and philosophy. And these are 2 guys that are just 2 mates who are talking. And I've been listening to them for a very long time. And I realized that I do the same thing with James, who was, well, before we started the podcast, because he went to Boston, I went to Oslo, and we just kept talking, whether it was over Slack, over email, or just a Skype talk. And I'm like, we're already doing what they're doing on Very Bad Wizards. Let's just record this. And that's how it really started. I like other sort of more science ones, like Ologies. It's just a cool sort of science podcast. What are the ones I'm listening to? I listen to I'm a bit of a Mac nerd. I listen to a few Apple podcasts.
Like about Apple products? Or
yeah. Like
okay.
Software and hardware.
Yeah, that is nerdy.
That's extremely nerdy. So yeah, that's usually the. I like the Ezra Klein podcast as well. The old.
Well, I've heard about that, but what exactly is that? I've heard the name, but I don't know what it is.
Politics, sort of current affairs type stuff. So yeah, but those are the main ones. But
actually, yeah, I just realized. So I've had. This is now the second episode that I'm talking to someone who has a podcast also about podcasting. The other is with Cody Commerce, who has the Cognitive Revolutions podcast, or Revolution, I guess it's one. I think he actually also mentioned Ezra Klein's. Yeah. So I think now 100% of the people great. Say they like that one. Maybe I should actually check it out.
Check it out. Just interesting people. The way that he asks questions is very interesting. I also like history podcasts as well. There's one, each episode is like 3 hours long.
So the Hardcore History.
Hardcore History, that's the one. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm slightly confused because I've looked for it and they're on Apple Podcasts, there's only a few episodes or something available.
I think maybe it's a thing where you have to subscribe to get the older ones, but possibly.
Okay, but that was even before Apple had.
Oh, I'm not sure.
This like payment method that's like half a year old or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to one of them, but yeah, it's just so long.
I love it. Like when I'm lying on the beach on holiday, I'm like, I'm going to learn about the fall of Rome. Yeah. You know, it's and the way it's dramatized. Anyway, if you're into, like, I'm sort of loosely interested in history, so that's a very good one.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Actually, we have so one question I have is about, you can be as specific as you want to, but if you don't want to share the specifics, you don't have to. About kind of, for example, like the size of Everything Hertz and how it kind of grew over time and that kind of stuff. I mean, like, you mentioned now, you said almost 1 million downloads, and I checked, there's this, I don't know how accurate this is, but there's this website called Listen Notes. It's just a website with lots of podcasts, and I think it's basically like a directory of podcasts where you can listen to podcasts, something like that. They also have rankings, or not ranking exactly, but let's say kind of the top X% the popular podcasts are. And apparently Everything Hertz in the top 1.5%
Kidding.
podcasts on that
That's
website.
A surprise. Yeah. That's amazing.
And so the thing is, I know that Buzzsprout, the company I use for my hosting, they have stats about all the podcasts that they publish and what the downloads they get. And I think the top 1% get like 3,000 downloads in the first week or something like that. So just based on that, it seems like you're getting quite a lot of downloads per episode right by now.
We get about, I'd say about sort of 10,000 a week, but 10,000 is
in total, like across all episodes.
Across all episodes.
Yeah.
A given episode within the first week would be sort of around 4,000 to 5,000.
Okay. Pretty good estimate then. Yeah.
This, like, we started off very, very slow. We started off as a psychophysiology podcast because that's what we both did, and then we realized there's about like 10 people in the world interested in what we do. So then as soon as we started doing more episodes around research methods and life as another career researcher, that's when a lot of interest sort of kicked up. But yeah, I mean, look, I think things really started kicking off around sort of episode 50, and then it sort of rises and rises from there. And
do you know why? Just because that's also rough. I mean, I was a bit later than that from listening to yours, but yeah,
I don't know. I think, it takes time for momentum to start, or for momentum to gather. Also, I think we began to hit our stride a little bit more, became a little bit more confident with what we were doing. The sort of format that we do kind of crystallized a bit more by then. And we also started getting guests around episode 50. I think it was around then. And of course, guest episodes tend to have increased downloads typically. Not always, but typically they tend to have increased downloads. And yeah, so then I think even since then, like, it sort of really increased around episode 50, and then it's just slowly increases. So we haven't seen that kind of explosion that we saw around then. But we still continue at that rate of about sort of 10,000 or so downloads a week, and new episodes sort of get sort of anywhere from sort of like 5,000 to 8,000 downloads from So it's cool. It's really encouraging to see. We get some like really nice emails from people.
Right,
yeah, it's really cool. Like I don't know. We never expected that we'd sort of get past 10 episodes. We kind of said to ourselves, let's just try for 10 and see where it goes. And I think we're 4 years in, episode 100, and I'm just editing, I think 146 or 147 at the moment. And it's been a great ride.
I mean, do you sometimes just, the classic, like, sit down and go like, hang on, 5,000 people are going to listen to this in the first week.
Yeah, it's still, I mean, look.
Like, that's, the classic, like, that's a big theater, right?
It's pretty
It's more
wild.
like stadium size almost now, 5,000. Like,
but I mean, look, that's the amount of people who are downloading it to their device. We don't know.
so it's like 5 people.
It could be. I mean, because a lot of people it just kind of happens, and then they never actually listen to the thing. That's a blessing and a curse of podcasts. Is the metrics are very weak. We only know how many devices are being downloaded to, where they're located, and the type of devices, which is very good. There are some companies that are really trying to monetize podcasts, and by doing that, they're trying to force you to use a podcast app, because the podcast app is getting information and basically telling the creators, you lost attention at minute 5, be edgier. And it's changing podcasts, for the worse. The fact that the metrics are very broad, I think, is very good, because it's meaning people are just making what they want to make. Once you have too many metrics and people are sort of not, like with YouTube, for instance, if you look at the metrics, you can see at what point of the video people started logging off, and then people start tweaking their thing and becoming more, doing crazier stuff in order to keep attention. But with podcasts, it's staying pure, so to speak, because those metrics are not.
Sorry. Yeah.
Go on. Yeah. The metrics aren't influencing people.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've heard is that, and that seems to be roughly true also for my episodes, is that podcasts do have really high retention rates though over time, relative. Especially, I think, if you look at YouTube's graphs, apparently it's pretty much exponential, like fall off in the first 10 seconds or whatever. Because most people realize, I guess you have a YouTube channel. Yeah, you probably know this much better than me. But for podcasts, it's, I think, much more stable. And I don't know, have you looked at the Spotify stuff? Because Spotify gives, through Buzzsprout, they do this fairly automatically, where I can look at the stats. It's just, in the first 3 episodes, it seemed to me to be pretty correct, where you saw like nuanced like changes over time. But somehow for me, over the last few episodes, it's been like, it says like I have X amount of listeners, and all of them have this, like listen to the entire thing, or listen, whatever, like 70%. Yeah, it's just, it doesn't look like real data basically anymore.
I haven't looked closely at the stats. I think maybe 5% of our listeners listen via Spotify. 5 to 10% maybe.
Oh, really? I have quite a lot actually. Okay.
Because we don't sort of promote it heavily. We kind of say, hey, it's an option. But because a lot of our people began listening to us because they subscribe through their apps that they already have. Maybe more recent listeners are going through Spotify. But I haven't actually looked closely at the data there to see when are we losing our listeners? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, because sometimes I think one thing that is a bit annoying about podcasting is that you really lack the kind of infrastructure that you have for videos through YouTube. And, sometimes I think YouTube is amazing because you get stats. Like, let's say you do the same thing every time and you think it's cool and everyone hates it. Maybe you should keep it in because you think it's cool, but maybe you should take it out because it sucks, And I guess if you get no feedback, you never know. And also the fact that, with podcasting, you don't really get even proper numbers about anything, because some people listen through that app, some through that, some through this, some through that, right? Sometimes I do wish, like, can't someone please make like a proper YouTube for podcasts? But yeah, I guess it does have downsides too.
Mm-hmm.
One question I have about, so finances is something I don't really need to be thinking about much with my podcast in terms of sponsorship, Patreon, whatever. I just don't have the download numbers right now for that to make sense, I don't think. But I'm just curious how you kind of think about that topic. I think you mentioned in your blog post you started using Patreon from episode 75 onwards, or something like that. Yeah, how's kind of your experience been with Patreon and kind of monetizing the podcast? I mean, yours is, maybe to say up front, what's the word? That you don't make non-profit, basically, right?
Yeah, so all the money goes back in to the podcast.
Mine would be non-profit in the very technical sense, or non-profit. I guess if it costs me every month, that's also not profit.
Not profit.
So how kind of do you think about starting to get some money from listeners through this or through advertising, and maybe also if you are willing to / can talk about this, some of your sponsors you've had, how did that happen? Did you contact them or vice versa? Or how does that work?
I think we've had 4 different sponsors and all of them contacted us. I think because people within their companies listen to the show and they're like, this is the sort of audience that we want to get to. So they got in touch with us. But I think out of 140 episodes, I think maybe 20 have been sponsored episodes, so to speak.
Oh, really? That okay? Some I thought it was okay. I thought it was more, but okay.
No, so we haven't had that many. So maybe 20 or 30, and for us, getting those sponsors is a bonus, which means that we're very picky about who we actually choose.
Sorry, the sponsors are Site. Wait, then you've had Prolific, right?
Prolific, Site, Paperpile, and
another very important sponsor.
I know
that you value dearly.
I know.
Dan, I'm giving you so much. Come on, I can't say much more about how much you love that sponsor.
Our current sponsor is Site. Site,
okay,
Site, Paperpile, Prolific, and another one which we've had. But look, so we have that, and then we also have our patrons. I think we waited a very long time until we actually asked people. And I think what a lot of people forget is that some people really want to support the show, and there's no way for them to do that typically other than from sort of talking about the show on social media.
Tweeting about it at best, yeah.
Yeah. And once you actually give that opportunity, you'll be surprised how people want to just go, hey, I really enjoy what you're doing and I want to give a little bit back. And that's been really good. And what we do is we release 2 episodes a month, and those are always free. They're typically from sort of 45 minutes to a bit over an hour. And as a bonus to our patrons, then we do a bonus episode, which is like 10 minutes. And that's what we sort of release. We also have like discounts on our merch. We do have merchandise, make very little money off that.
I thought you said at one point that that's basically zero.
It's basically zero. Yeah. So it's literally like 10%, 5%. And for our patrons, it's essentially free. But we just have it there because some people were like, hey, do you have t-shirts or mugs? And it costs us nothing.
So do people actually use merchandise? I always find it really weird when people want like t-shirts. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not someone who I guess you're wearing a NASA t-shirt right now, if I can tell that correctly. Yeah. So maybe I'm just the wrong person for this, but I never get the whole, like, I want to own something in my house.
People do it, yeah. People do it. So I think our most popular things that we sell are shirts, hoodies, and mugs. Those are the things that people want to support the show. I think that's great. But yeah, so all the money that we make goes back in. It goes for equipment, be it hardware and software. It's just, you can do podcasts on the cheap or essentially free, but having some software makes it a bit quicker doing it that way. So it's been nice, but it's also good that just to give listeners a way just to show their appreciation for what we're doing on the show. And Patreon's been great, and it's another way for people to contact us because there's contact within the Patreon app. But yeah, look, I'm very glad that we waited until episode 70, and I think maybe 2/3 of our patrons that we have now, we've been doing it for about 2 years now, 2/3 signed up within the first week. These were the hardcore fans.
Oh, really?
That have been listening.
That's cool though, right?
Yeah,
that must
really
be great.
Like that initial, like we had no idea whether people would actually, we're thinking maybe we'll get 10 people and maybe we'll just be able to cover the hosting costs and we'll just be able to cover getting new microphones and that's it. But we're pleasantly surprised. And, we still get new people that sort of come on board, but the majority of our patrons were from the very beginning because we built 70 episodes of goodwill, so to speak. And as soon as you said, "Hey, we're doing this thing, you can get bonus episodes, and you can support the show," then it just happened. So it's really nice to see.
But so, what do you do with that money? I mean, I get like, I obviously know that podcasting costs money, but I think it says, I just checked, was it $345 a month or something?
Yeah.
So, I mean, assuming you're not actually getting that, right? That's probably before Patreon takes their cut.
Yeah, so Patreon takes their cut.
Which is what, 30% or something? It's quite high.
Not that high. Yes. I think it's 15 or something. But look, this I have to count this as income. So I have to put aside a lot of that for tax as well.
You can't do that like separately. You have to do it as for you personally, kind of. Or...
Yes, I mean, I could have set up a separate thing, but it's too much of a pain. So this is, regardless, it is.
So we're funding like Norwegian roads or whatever.
No, seriously, I have to. Like it is like it has to be treated as income. So there's just setting up a non-profit within Norway. It's not suited for a podcast. Let's just say that. So yeah, so Patreon takes a cut. Then obviously I have to put stuff aside for paying tax. But then yeah, so these things, hosting the podcast, hosting the website, paying for stuff. We use Melon as a service occasionally for speaking with guests. That costs money. The hardware, the microphones, and all the stuff associated with that.
Okay. I mean, to be fair, just the fact that you have to tax that makes a big difference. So I assumed I don't know, I hadn't really thought about this too clearly, but I just assumed like, okay, you're getting like, I don't know, 250 to 300 of that dollars plus whatever your sponsors make per episode, per month. But I guess if you're taxing that amount, then yeah. Then suddenly it becomes a lot more clear what you're doing with that money.
Yeah. It's one of those things like you can't really. I can't really argue it's a hobby. It's money's coming in every month. But so it's equipment and hosting costs. What one thing we want to do is we're now at the point where we can start sending out microphones to guests as well.
I was going to ask, are you doing that or
no? We want to start doing that now, because now we're at the point where we can sort of even after tax and all that kind of stuff, looking at the numbers, it's something that we can start doing. At least sort of something on the cheaper side, but it's much better than doing a laptop microphone.
I guess the good thing is also that I have basically two interviews a month on average, but I guess you don't do interviews every time, right? So that also makes it much more manageable for you to actually do that almost all the time.
Yeah. So I think that's something that can really help. But also the software. So I use getting a little bit technical into the weeds. I use Isotope to do my editing, and it's fantastic. It's heavily automated. It's not cheap, but it just means I can spend less time doing editing, for instance.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask like one, not necessarily like, feel free to mention like specific things you use, because that's, I think, very useful. I mean, just to clarify, I use Audacity still, and you can, unless you're doing something like, if you want to do like super cool edited stuff, then maybe something more complicated. But for something like this, Audacity does pretty much everything you need, but it's just a lot of labor intensive. But I was curious, do you still edit your podcast yourself then? I guess I assumed you had also more income through Patreon than you do, but why? I'm just curious, because I guess at some point I'm assuming you and James could put some money personally aside to do this, and then you have more time basically, right?
I don't know. I still like having that control. We don't do much editing at all. So we hardly cut anything out, but I still like doing that. And I'm the one that's writing the summaries as well, and re-listening to it and editing it helps me write.
You listen through the entire thing or?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So then, it means that I can listen through and we talk about a thing. I'm like, I have to actually get the link for that too. So I like having that sort of reminder about what we spoke about, because sometimes it might be like a week or two from between we actually do the recording from when I actually do the editing as well. So it's good to re-listen to these things. So I mean, even if we had a lot more money, then I still think I do the editing myself, just because.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah. Just so I can sort of re-listen to the episode, but also if there is a bit that we do cut out, even though we don't do it that much, at least I know and have that full control of like, yep, that's going to be the bit.
Okay, it's interesting just because, I mean, I guess I also do a weekly podcast and my episodes are longer, so that just, I spend so much time editing. Like at some point, I'm just getting fed up with it.
Yeah.
But I've really considered, because I have the same thing that I guess Hours a Day was one of the least technical episodes I've almost done. But often I have some episodes where I have like 20 references in the list or something because we talked about, mentioned so many papers and whatever. And obviously, pretty much I have to do that. But there's some episodes where I have like book discussions or something where someone else could do it. And I might do this from like next year on, basically say like, someone please help me.
And you can totally do that. But I mean, I think right now it's not too much of a time in position because I don't do too much editing. I very rarely take out pauses, for instance, or if there's a bit of the episode, if it sounds a bit awkward, we keep it in because it's real. That's what conversations are like. And we always want to give that impression of this is what a conversation sounds like. So it doesn't take super long because fortunately we do have patrons, so I can pay for software that can automate a lot of the stuff which comes to fixing a lot of the audio, and I save a lot of time in that way. So I'm very fortunate that we do have the patrons, so I can actually automate a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I guess maybe as a kind of last point about editing, for anyone who's interested in doing the podcast their own, I think I will say that one of the time-consuming aspects of my job in that sense is that I have a new guest every other week at least, which means I have no idea what audio is going to happen that week. I guess if you and James are doing an episode between you, or if I'm doing a book club with a friend, I know what the audio is going to be like. But I've had some episodes where I spent like 8 hours editing the thing because there was like sounds that were so like irregular and annoying, and like I just couldn't figure out how to do difference. It. Yeah, I guess that probably makes a huge, because those are the ones that kill me, like a 2-hour interview. And the sound is awful, and I
didn't take a lot. Yeah, I mean, we're the same thing. Like some guests don't have the equipment, and that's totally reasonable. But
exactly.
It means it just takes a little bit of extra time to do that. Those ones take extra time, but because I'd say 3/4 of the episodes are just James and I, then the edits are a lot quicker.
Okay, cool.